boy. Is he dead too?
Who?
The boy, Jason.
Jason?
In the lake, the one who attacked me, the one who pulled me underneath the water.
Ma'am, we didn't find any boy.
Then he's still there.
I really don't know what age is too old for trick-or-treating. Perhaps it depends on how you go about it. I mean, if you're 14 and relying on your mom to buy you a costume and drive you around at night, yeah, that's pretty sad. I figured at 15, if I made my own costume and decided to circle the block with friends on foot, I could get away with it. Friends make it okay, because it resembles a party gathering. Going alone would be a cry for help. Last Halloween, I applied some heavy makeup to my face and wore some tattered clothing, and decided to pass myself off as a Walking Dead type zombie. It was a pretty poor excuse for a costume. But when you're in high school, who are you trying to impress when you're going out collecting free candy anyway? I started off trick-or-treating with a few of my friends, but everybody except me kept stopping every other minute to glance at their phones. I got tired of them holding me up, so I eventually put some distance between myself and them. And before I knew it, a single house gap of space between us had become several houses, and suddenly, I was by myself. I left the sidewalk and wandered back and forth across the street to the remaining houses like an idiot, oblivious to speeding cars, and beginning to feel like the candy wasn't worth the growing feeling of embarrassment anymore. As I made my way toward the last house, a tall figure in a Jason Voorhees costume came down the sidewalk, coming from the opposite direction, and walked right up to me. The guy was at least 6 feet tall. He was holding what could have been a very real machete, and gets close enough to cut my throat. I didn't even flinch. "Nice costume. Where's Freddy?" "I killed him," he responded behind the mask, without that reassuring hint of playful sarcasm. He pulled a clear plastic bag of multicolored candies out of his pocket and motioned for me to open up my pillowcase. When I complied, he dropped them in. The plastic bag wasn't even sealed, so the candies scattered all through my bag as I spun the pillowcase closed. "Eat those first. They're great." He then just walked right past me and disappeared. I didn't ask what kind of candies they were. I didn't even have a chance to thank him. I just shrugged and kept on moving. After I stopped at the last house, I headed back towards my place. There were still a handful of trick-or-treaters scattered around, but no one close by. My group of friends had been left far behind. I spun my pillowcase open and rummaged through the candies as I walked, looking to inhale a couple before I got home. I dug around in the bag and pulled out a random handful. All of them were individually wrapped, except for the multicolored loose ones that Jason had given me. I figured they were Mike and Ike's or something, and I stopped to pop a few in my mouth. When I paused, they were abnormally sticky and were stuck to my hand. I set my pillowcase down so I could unstick them when I happened to glance off to the side. Across the street, far behind me, I saw Jason walking in my direction. When I noticed him, he noticed me, and he stopped and just stared at me, unmoving. I grabbed my pillowcase and power walked up the sidewalk, down my driveway and into the garage. I closed the garage door and went inside. From the front window, I watched Jason continue down the sidewalk. He stopped just short of our property line and just stared at my house. All the lights were off on the ground floor, so I knew that he couldn't see me, so I decided to wait him out. After maybe 3 or 4 minutes, he turned around and slowly walked off back the way he came from, then vanished into the night. As creepy as I thought that was, no red flag shot up in regards to the candy he had given me. I decided to wash my face and hands before going through the bag of candy. I deliberately ignored the loose ones because I remembered how sticky they were. The following morning, my parents asked me about my haul. I dumped out my pillowcase onto the table to show them, and immediately my parents noticed the loose candies. My mom gathered up a few in her hand. "Where did you get these?" she asked, looking more alarmed than curious. Some random guy out on the street dressed up like Jason Voorhees," I replied. "These are prescription drugs and food coloring," my mom replied, her voice somewhere between enraged and terrified. Yeah, I think I've outgrown trick-or-treating. A few years ago, I was driving home while drunk at around 3 a.m. I live so deep out in the woods that it takes about 15 minutes of steady driving before I encounter a road with a dividing line for both lanes. Maybe another 10 after that before I hit the first traffic light. My driveway alone is about 60 or so yards long, and most people traveling down that road who get lost wind up in my front lawn before they realize that they're on private property. Now, I don't advocate driving drunk, but I was going about 30 miles an hour down a forgotten road where there was next to no chance of encountering another driver, let alone a pedestrian. I was much more worried about hitting a deer. My head was pounding, and I had to pee, but I did not want to increase my speed in case I wound up in a ditch. My high beams were on, and my windows were down. The cold night air hitting my face made me feel like I was being waterboarded. I took a sharp turn down a more open stretch of road, where I could see a few dozen yards ahead of me. But I slammed on the brakes in shock that quickly evolved into pure terror. Power walking down the middle of the road, coming directly towards me, was a man who looked like he was wearing a mechanic's jumpsuit. For half a second I considered that he might be lost or wrecked his car and was coming to ask for help, which by itself would have been random enough to be alarming, but I soon dismissed that notion. This man was wearing one of those old hockey masks. It genuinely looked like Jason Voorhees was charging toward my car, intending to rip me to pieces. There are several things I could have done in that moment. I could have rolled up the windows and locked the doors. I could have floored it in reverse. I could have abandoned my car and sprinted into the trees. But most of the time, the easiest solution is the first one that pops into your mind. I hit the gas, aiming just off center so I would miss him, but not by much. I felt something graze against the side of my car as I whizzed by. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and by the harsh red glow of my taillights, I noticed he was still on his feet, watching as I drove down the road. I pressed on my garage door opener as soon as my house came into view. I quickly pulled in, killed the engine, and closed the garage door behind me. The 8 or so seconds it took to fully close felt like the longest few moments of my life. Then the silence hit me, and I was suddenly terrified. Had I just accidentally hit somebody? I was drunk behind the wheel of a car and made contact with a pedestrian. Should I call the cops? Then I remembered the terrifying way this man moved. It was with purpose, very much trying to get away from or get to something. I then pressed my hands to my face. All this guy had to do was turn around and follow the road, and he would walk right up to my front porch. I don't recall if he was carrying a weapon of any kind, but regardless, I was willing to bet that I had just pissed him off. I ran inside without turning on any lights. I double-checked every door and window, making sure they were locked up tight. And then I did the last thing I figured an intruder would expect. I climbed back into my car, locked myself inside, and curled up in my sleeping bag. There were no windows in my garage, and my car windows were tinted. After a few minutes, I began to calm down and feel safer. I had my phone on me, and I could have called the cops, but I ultimately decided that wasn't a good idea, given my alcohol consumption. Also, I figured it would take them about an hour to get out there, and in that time, the man in the hockey mask could either kill me or hide out in the forest and wait for them to leave. Despite the craziness of what just happened, I fell asleep. I had a nightmare about Jason Voorhees being outside my house, pounding on the garage door, trying to get inside. I woke up miserable and hungover at around 11. I got out of the car, cautiously peeking inside the kitchen. All the doors and windows were still secured. There were no signs of forced entry. I began to feel better. I worked up the nerve to take a shower, change clothes, and then patrolled the outside of my house with the biggest kitchen knife I had. With the sun shining bright, I felt insanely confident and brave all of a sudden. But that quickly changed when I noticed the fresh scratches on the locks to both the front and back door. Had somebody tried to break inside after all? Lockpicking was never Jason Voorhees' style. I figured he would have just shattered a window. The rest of that day I spent dreading the sunset, terrified the man in the hockey mask would come back and finish me off. Right before night fell, I backed my car out of the garage, having decided to head to a friend's house. That's when I noticed something in my rearview mirror. There was a blade jammed into the left side of my car, just above the back wheel well. I was so apprehensive about somebody breaking into my house that I had forgotten to check my car. The blade had stabbed through the car's side, and you could clearly see the gouge trailing behind it. I remembered feeling something grazing my car as I drove past the figure on the road the night before. That's when he must have done this. And whoever he was, he had been strong enough and insane enough to drive a blade into the side of a passing car. Had I actually stopped, who knows what would have happened. I was suddenly extremely glad that I decided to hit the gas. Back in the early 2000s, I was working at a bank in the middle of nowhere, Maine. I usually worked as the teller for the drive-through window and never had any problems. There used to be a running joke amongst my group of coworkers that I would be the last one to ever get robbed, because there was always a solid wall of bulletproof glass between myself and the people in their cars. I guess it was because I laughed too hard at that joke that karma eventually found me, and it had an axe to grind. I don't remember the exact date of this incident, but it was closing in on Halloween. The days were much shorter, and it was getting dark much earlier. By 5 p.m., it felt like 10 p.m., and that was around the time we were closing up for the day. I remembered packing up my bag, putting on my coat in the break room, when one of my coworkers made an announcement that there was someone out in the parking lot loitering. I figured it was some homeless man crossing the lot, making his way to the gas station across the street. But I decided to play it safe and wait with the others for the guy to wander off. I walked around to the back of the counter and parked myself in my usual spot by the drive-through window, while the others kind of clustered by the front door and made small talk while keeping an eye on the guy. I was flipping through my pocket calendar when I heard one of my coworkers say something along the lines of, "Wait, is he wearing some kind of mask?" referring to the man outside. I turned in my chair and looked. I was about to say something about it being close to Halloween when an ear-splitting slam right behind me made me leap out of my chair. I screamed and staggered, nearly falling down. I turned and saw directly outside the window there was a man in a hockey mask and flannel shirt raising an axe above his head. The axe met the glass for a second time. It split the air so loudly I felt it in the back of my teeth. After the second strike, the man must have realized this glass was not going to break. He lowered the axe and took a few steps back away from the window, while my coworkers screamed behind me. The man looked me dead in the eye, raised his left hand, and made a cutting motion across his throat with a small knife he had clenched in his fist. He then took off running into the darkness. The police were there in a matter of minutes and swept the entire plaza, but were unable to locate the man in the hockey mask or the other man we had seen in the parking lot. The police suspected that they were working in tandem, one man distracting us while the other entered through the back. They asked me if there were any features I could specifically remember about him, but all I could recall with any clarity were his cold blue eyes behind his hockey mask. It gave me the worst fright of my life, but the following day I was back at work, and I still work at that same bank to this day, though now I work for a different branch. I have no idea if that man actually believed an axe would be enough to get through that glass, or if he was just trying to scare us, but that knife he had clenched in his other hand bothered me and haunted my dreams for weeks after. A knife that small would not have helped him breaking through the window, but why would he have brought it if he hadn't planned on using it? In those aforementioned nightmares, sometimes he manages to shatter the window, and once inside, he uses that knife on me. This didn't happen to me. This was my mother's experience. I'll give you some background before we get into the incident. My mother was 11 years old at the time, living in the same bedroom that I currently live in now. Our house is very old and is located in a very secluded area. Our nearest neighbor is at least 5 miles away. The bedroom faces the backyard, which is inaccessible from the front yard unless you scale a metal fence. Now on to the night in question. I will tell the rest of the story from my mother's perspective. One night at about 2 a.m., I was sleeping in my bedroom when I was woken up by the sound of scratching on my window. It sounded like branches from a nearby tree were rubbing against the screen of my window. I tried my best to ignore it, but the noise persisted. It kept happening in intervals, with about 10 seconds in between. Then I realized something. There were no trees or branches by my window. There were some along the other side of the house, but not where my room is. That's when I decided to get out of bed and take a look. I stood there, listening, terrified to see what was behind the blinds. I gathered up as much courage as possible and yanked the blinds back. A tall figure stood on the other side, wearing a Jason Voorhees hockey mask. I was frozen in fear. I then noticed a knife in the man's hand that he had been rubbing against the screen. We looked at each other for what felt like hours. Then suddenly, the man turned around and ran away, disappearing into the forest. Once I snapped out of my trance, I screamed bloody murder and ran to go get my father. He ran outside with a shotgun and tried to find the man, but he was long gone by then. I still have no idea if this was some kind of prank or if he planned on entering the house and lost his nerve once he saw me. Keep in mind that our house is in the middle of nowhere, so the implication is that either some lunatic was wandering around the forest in a hockey mask, or someone traveled a very long distance just to pull a prank. Needless to say, this shook us up for a while. If someone was indeed watching our house there were plenty of places for them to hide. But thankfully, nothing like that ever happened again. Last Halloween, I was invited to a company bonfire party in the most heavily forested area of upstate New York. I wasn't really interested in going, but given that I could bring a group of friends, I was kind of peer pressured into accepting. The company I worked for was hosting, and the venue was to have an open bar. So I reluctantly went shopping to find a halfway decent costume to wear. The night of the party, I assigned myself as the designated driver, and I drove my 4 rowdy friends to the party. I flashed my company ID at the security gate, and we made our way to the party. Most of my friends had very elaborate and flashy costumes with props and makeup, but I simply bought an Assassin's Creed hoodie and decided to go as Michael Fassbender. The party was loud and intense, with music blaring and booze flowing, and people ultimately acting like in no way their actions would be recorded and posted online the very next day. I eventually got bored of the noise and drunken behavior and wandered into the woods with my friends Kate and Leon. There were signs prompting us to stick to the designated trails, which we, of course, ignored. We ventured deeper into the forest, looking for a nice spot to get a good look at the night sky. After a few minutes, we were out of earshot of the party. We turned on the flashlights on our phones and tried to find a comfortable spot to sit down. After a moment, I heard Leon call over to us, and we navigated our way over to him. We didn't have to say anything, because we saw it as soon as we saw him. Laying on the ground in front of him was a queen-sized mattress, which would have been surprising on its own. But even more strange than that, there were bright red stains all over it. Kate bent over, and without hesitation, felt the mattress with her 2 fingers. Kate happened to be a phlebotomist, and was very comfortable around blood. It's still wet, she said after a moment. Wait, so that's real? Leon asked. No way. This has to be some kind of prop. We're at a Halloween party, guys, remember? I said with confidence. Then why is it all the way up here in the woods, where we almost didn't find it? Kate replied. I examined the mattress again, and shifted the angle of my flashlight. I hadn't noticed it before, but there was a clean, unmarked spot right in the center of the mattress, about the average size of a human torso. My mouth began to quiver. Kate, in theory, if somebody lost this much blood, would they still be all right? Not unless they were outside of an ER. Hey, come here, Leon called out. Kate and I glanced up and saw another partygoer come forward out of the shadows. He was wearing a Daryl Dixon angel wing vest and carrying a crossbow, but a Jason Voorhees hockey mask concealed his face. Leon kept talking. Hey man, we just found this mattress here. Did you hear or see anything? The man didn't respond. He only glanced around the 3 of us without saying a word. And suddenly, there was tension in the air. Kate then addressed the man in the mask. Are you with the company? The guy then slowly raises his crossbow, aiming it directly at her. Whoa! I called out and shoved Kate sideways, right as the man fired at her. The arrow sailed past her arm and planted itself into a tree behind us. That crossbow was very real. Leon then ran up to the guy and shoved him as he went to load another arrow into his crossbow. We each ran off in different directions. I immediately turned off my flashlight so the guy couldn't take aim at me. I sprinted towards the light of the bonfire, stumbling twice and skinning my knee. I bolted out of the woods and directly over to the DJ's booth and started gasping about there being a guy with a crossbow in the forest who had just tried to kill us. But of course, nobody took me seriously. Kate and Leon had made their way to the security station in the parking lot, but the security guards didn't believe them either. I even tried speaking to one of the company owners, but he was drunk and completely unconcerned by the news. We called the cops from the parking lot, but after waiting an hour in my car, no one ever showed up. We gathered the rest of my friends and left. We went to the police station and filed a report. It's been nearly a year, and we haven't heard back about any kind of investigation or follow-up. I still have no idea what the context was of what we found that night. I don't know if somebody was attacked on that mattress, and we wandered into a fresh crime scene, or if it was just some kind of elaborate gag, and we're now on a YouTube prank video somewhere, looking like a bunch of idiots. But what bothered me the most was that in that moment, the seriousness of the situation felt very real. And when that crossbow fired, I felt the sense of extreme danger so bad that my flight or fight reaction immediately took over. I don't think I'll be celebrating Halloween this year.
My sweet, sweet Jason. Mommy is proud of you. Now come home.
There's always a reason to be afraid.